Welcome to Harvest Mission Community Church. You are listening to one of our sermons.
Good morning, church. This is Pastor Ben from Austin, Texas. Hopefully you guys are doing well. Trying a new setup, so hopefully this looks okay. I'm going to start off with a story. There's a story about a store that sells husbands. It's a place where a woman can choose a husband from amongst many men. The store is composed of 6 floors, and the men increase in positive attributes as the shopper ascends the flights. There is, however, a catch. As you open the door to any floor, you may choose a man from that floor, but if you go up a floor, you cannot go back down except to exit the building. So one day, a woman goes to the shopping center to find a husband. On the first floor, the sign of the door reads, "Floor 1, these men have jobs." The woman reads the sign and says to herself, "Well, that's better than my last boyfriend, but I wonder what's further up." So up she goes. The second floor sign reads, "Floor 2, these men have jobs and love kids." The woman remarks to herself, "That's great, but I wonder what's further up," and up she goes again. The third floor sign reads, "Floor 3, these men have jobs, love kids, and are extremely good looking." Better, she said, but I wonder what's upstairs. The fourth floor sign reads, "Floor 4, these men have jobs, love kids, are extremely good looking, and help with the household work." "Wow," exclaimed the woman, "very tempting, but there must be more." Again, she heads up another flight. The fifth floor sign reads, "Floor 5, these men have jobs, loves kids, extremely good looking, help with the household work, and have a strong romantic streak." "Oh, mercy me, but just think, what must be awaiting me further?" So up to the 6th floor she goes. The 6th floor sign reads, "Floor 6, you are visitors 6,456,789,012 to this floor. There are no men on this floor. This floor exists solely as proof that women are impossible to please." We are talking about marriage this morning, reimagining marriage through the biblical lens. Because we recognize that there actually is a big gap in how the Bible describes marriage versus how the rest of the world would define what marriage is, or I would even say our own perception of what marriage is supposed to be. My wife and I, we've been married 22 years now. And when we first got married, I didn't realize just how much of my expectations for our marriage was shaped not necessarily by biblical truths, but by how my parents did their marriage. And that was the example for me. So I remember one of the big fights that happened in our marriage is when we did our first road trip. We were living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we decided, hey, we're going to get away for a couple of days to Toronto, Canada, and we did a road trip. But unlike Michigan, Canada has a toll road system, which means that there are tolls along the way and you have to pay the toll. So I remember encountering our first toll, and without just me even thinking about it, I just stuck out my hand like this to my wife, and I looked at her, expecting her to hand over the specific change that I would need for the toll. But then I didn't get the change. Rather, I got this look back like, "What are you asking me for?" And I remember that turning into a very tense situation. And I think part of it was because there was cars behind us. And so we had to find someone who could help and all that stuff. But I realized it's because in our family, whenever we did things like that, it was usually my mom who took care of those types of things in my family. But for Susan and her family, it was actually her dad. And so our expectations were very different. And so we got into this heated discussion of what should have been done, right? I think it's true that so much of how we understand what marriage is actually shaped not necessarily by biblical truths, but by what we see in the culture and by the examples that we've seen as we've grown up. So I want us to reimagine marriage, not necessarily through the lens of culture, of how the culture would dictate what marriage is supposed to look like, or through the lens of our family, how marriage has been demonstrated for us in our families, but through the biblical lens. With that in mind, this is going to be more of a topical sermon, and so it's not necessarily going to be an exposition of a specific passage, but I do want to start from Ephesians 5. And we're going to look at Ephesians 5:22 through 32, and I have my big Bible here. And let me go ahead and read this for us. Once again, Ephesians 5:22 through 32. It says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband." So the one thing that I want to give us this morning simply is this. Our marriage should strive to be a reflection of God's love and commitment to his people. But when you think about our marriage, it should strive to reflect God's love and commitment to his people. So there's two things that we want to talk about this morning. First of all, I want to talk about God's design for marriage. And then I want to spend some time talking about our preparation for marriage. So God's design for marriage, and then our preparation for marriage. So let's first of all talk about God's design for marriage. Now, when you think about marriage, just think about how important marriage is to God. All the way back in creation in Genesis 1 and 2, when we see God creating the world, marriage was actually part of that blueprint of how God created the world. In Genesis 2:21 through 24, we read, "So the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place in the flesh. And the rib that the Lord had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. And the man said, 'This is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. Then they shall become one flesh.'" That means that marriage is not just a cultural concept of how we understand marriage in the US or how y'all understand marriage in Hong Kong. It's not the cultural concept that dictates how marriage should be, but really, when you think about the institution of marriage, the purpose of marriage, it's rooted in God's creation itself. So for us to understand God's design for marriage, first of all, we have to understand the foundation of marriage. And the foundation of marriage is not that man, it's not that woman, but the Bible makes it very clear that the foundation of marriage is God. Not only did God take men and women and he shaped them in his image, but he also entrusted to the first man and the first woman this wonderful gift of marriage. So think about just how fundamental marriage relationship is to human beings. So within the human society, there's all different types of relationships, right? But before a parent-child relationship, which is a very strong relationship, before sibling relationships, some of you think about the relationships that you have with your brother or your sister. Before friendship, God established the marriage relationship between one man and one woman to be one of the most foundational relationships in God's created world. And so we know that the most important relationship is with God himself, but foundational to his created order is the marriage relationship. And it's through that marriage relationship that men and women are called to participate with God in stewarding over creation. Look at Genesis 1:28. And God blessed them, man and woman. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, let me be careful in how I say this, because what I'm not saying is that only those who are married can participate in stewarding over God's creation. We know that's not true. But marriage plays a very significant role in how we are called to participate in stewardship, in stewarding over creation. For God says very clearly to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So marriage begins not when a man and a woman decide that they want to get married, but it begins with God himself, that God is the author of marriage. And that's why any relationship, any marriage relationship that does not reflect God's design for human marriage is not marriage. And within, at least here in the US and the greater culture, there's all different understandings of what marriage should be. But because we know that marriage starts not from human beings, but from God himself, that any marriage relationship that does not reflect God's intended design and purpose for marriage is not marriage. And God's design for human marriage is clear, that it's one man and one woman entering into this covenantal relationship before God, right? So, which leads to not only the foundation of marriage, but really the promise of marriage. Now, this is important for us to comprehend, because marriage, in many ways, at least in the greater culture, and I would say in the church as well, it has become an expression of this transactional relationship between two individuals. And I say transactional because we see in the greater society and even in the church that when marriage no longer fulfills their needs, right, or their desires, when the other person no longer seems to be keeping their end of the bargain or end of their contract, then we go on our separate ways. When the feelings are no longer there, it's easy for us to conclude that, you know what, we're really not getting what we want from this desire or from this relationship. And so we separate because it's no longer mutually beneficial. And in the US, it's actually called no fault divorce, right? People seeking divorce because of irreconcilable differences. Now, here is the reality of marriage. Marriage is two broken people entering into a relationship where you live to share everything with the other, which means it's two sinners trying to do life. And so it is going to be messy and it is going to be complicated. And you're going to argue over things like, how should the toilet paper go, right? Should it go so that it hangs this way or it hangs this way? It's going to be messy and complicated. Now, don't get me wrong. Marriage is wonderful. It's beautiful. And it's enjoyable. But at the same time, it's naive to think that every season of marriage is going to be filled with romance and warmth and sweetness. And I think all the married couples listening to this would testify with a loud amen that it's not. When two broken people come together to do life, it gets messy. Man, I remember moving down to Austin to plant a church. And for the first few years, it was a very stressful, fulfilling, but also at the same time, challenging and stressful journey. And just a lot that I was wrestling with, but all that I was wrestling with, it began to creep into my relationship with Susan, my wife. And man, it was during those years that we had some big misunderstandings, right? And at times it didn't feel very romantic. At times it didn't feel very warm. At times it felt like we were constantly at each other's throats. But we kept moving forward. We kept trying to work on our marriage because both of us, we understood that our marriage, it was established on this covenantal promise that we made not only to one another, but ultimately to God. And that's the promise of marriage, that it is a covenantal relationship, the sacred bond between a husband and a wife before God. So that in that covenant, we can declare for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part. And that's really the promise that we make to one another in marriage, right? Now, that language covenant is important because all throughout the Bible, that's how God relates to us. It's through the language of covenant, through the covenant that he makes with his people. And so covenant is this binding promise that God makes as he declares his eternal devotion and faithfulness to us, fully well knowing and understanding that we're going to always fall short. We're not going to measure up on our end. But even when God's people fall short, and don't get me wrong, there are consequences to when we fall short and when we sin. But we see over and over again, God remembering his promise to his people. And over again, God being faithful to the promise that he has declared over his people. And that's really the promise of a covenantal relationship, right? And marriage is a reflection of that covenant that God makes to his people. And that's why Paul, when talking about how husbands and wives should relate to one another, he says this in verse 23, this mystery is profound, yet I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. It refers to Christ and the church. The relationship between husband and wife is a witness to Christ's relationship to his church. It's a reflection of this covenantal promise that Jesus makes to his bride, to his church. And that's why in Malachi 2, when God addresses the unfaithfulness of Israel to their marriage vow, God says, hey, you're being unfaithful to the covenant. Malachi 2:14, we read, but you say, why does he not? Because the Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Right? Once again, we see God describing marriage in the language of a covenant, which means that marriage, it's not rooted in civil law. It's not even rooted in religious law. A marriage is rooted in divine law. Marriage covenant between a husband and a wife is a testimony of God's covenant with his people. This means a couple of things, and this is from a book called God, Marriage and Family. It's by Dr. Kosenberger and Jones. This is what they point out. First of all, because marriage is rooted in a covenant, it means that marriage it's sacred. Because it's not just merely a human agreement that a man and a woman enters into, but it's a relationship before God. And so marriage is sacred. Not only is marriage sacred, but secondly, it means that marriage is intended to be permanent. Right? So think about this. When the religious teachers were trying to entrap Jesus, and they were asking whether divorce was lawful for any cause, listen to how Jesus answers them in Matthew 19:4. He says, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So there are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. But Jesus talks about the permanence of marriage. Now, third, it means that marriage is exclusive, meaning that no other human relationship must come between the commitment between a husband and a wife. That it's an exclusive covenant that they make to one another. And that's why when you think about things like sexual immorality in marriage, it's so devastating because it's a violation of this exclusive promise that we make. And that's why it's so serious in God's eyes. So not only the foundation and the promise of marriage, but we see God's design for marriage in the role of husband and wife, right? So let's thirdly talk about the role in marriage. So how do we function within a marriage relationship? First, Paul calls for mutual submission. So when you think about how we function by mutually submitting to one another. Before he flushes out the role of a husband and the role of a wife, look at what he says in verse 21, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So within marriage, the first submission is to Christ. So we submit first to Christ. And as we submit to Christ, we learn to submit to one another. So how does this mutual submission play out? Well, Paul says for the husband, it plays out in a couple of ways. It means that he submits to Christ and his wife by being the head in that relationship. Now, this is really important. It's important for us to interpret what it means to be the head by the context of what Paul is writing rather than through the cultural understanding of what that could mean. Because the cultural understanding is going to vary depending on which culture you're from. And Paul makes it very clear. He says this is what it means to be the head of the family. First of all, he says it means that you sacrifice for your family. So he uses the example of Jesus being the savior of the church. You think about how does he become the savior of the church? Well, he becomes the savior of the church by what? Dying for the church. So sacrificing means that the needs and the interests of your wife comes before your own. So husbands, are you sacrificing for your family? Not only that, but secondly, Paul says you are the head of the family, meaning that you love your wife more than you love yourself. So he says, Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, right? He loved the church and he gave himself up for her, meaning that he loved the church more than he loved himself. So husbands, how are we doing in giving ourselves up for our wives? I've used this illustration before, and it's kind of silly to think about it, but sometimes, especially during the fall time when football games are on, the team that I grew up rooting for, because I grew up in the state of Minnesota, is the Minnesota Vikings. And I remember when we first got married, when my Vikings are playing on the TV, and then all of a sudden my wife asks me, "Hey Ben, can you do this for me? Or can you get the vacuum? Or can you help me with this?" and so forth. And the reality is that the reason why sometimes like I get like willing to do it, but then I'm like grumbling, right? And if I'm really honest with myself, it's because it's really tempting for me to love not necessarily my Vikings, but me watching my Vikings more than me loving my wife and helping her in that moment. But God reminds us that as husbands, that we need to give ourselves up to love and serve our wives. And lastly, being the head means that you ultimately take responsibility for your family. So Paul says Christ took responsibility by sanctifying the church. Right? He didn't say, well, you're kind of dirty, so I'm just going to leave you to it. You do it yourself. No, Christ said, well, you know what? You can't do it. But I'm going to lead you. I'm going to guide you through it. And I'm going to take responsibility for you. And so that's what it means, gentlemen, to be the head. It means that you take responsibility for your family, right? Doesn't mean that you get the final word. Doesn't mean that you get served first. But being the head means that you make sacrificial choices to serve and to love your wife and to take responsibility for whatever happens to your family, even if it's not your fault. And I remember in my family, this is a long time ago when I was in high school, my mom's car was parked in the garage, and she meant to reverse out of the garage, but I think she was in a hurry and got things mixed up. And next thing you know, instead of reversing out, she drove straight into the wall. And the wall shifted. And I remember when that happened, my dad took responsibility for it, even though it was my mom's fault, because he was the head of the house. He took responsibility for calling the insurance company and making sure that my mom was okay and the wall was fixed and all that stuff. It means that you take responsibility for your family. Now, for all the sisters, if a man loved you and honored you and served you in this way, then would you not want to serve him right back, right? And I would encourage for all the sisters who are not married, look for these traits in the guys that might be pursuing you. When you see them in various contexts, do they sacrifice for their life group members, for their family members, for their friends? Do they love God and His will for them more than loving themselves and their own desires? Do they take responsibility for their biblical family, even if it's not their fault? So for the husband, we submit to Christ and to our wives by being the head. Now for the wife, it means that she submits to Christ by submitting to her husband. And that's what Paul says. Now, once again, we have to understand this in the context of what Paul is saying and not through the cultural lens, right? Because submitting to her husband in the context of what Paul's saying is recognizing the husband's calling to be a servant leader, like how Christ was a servant leader, and not belittling or dishonoring that calling, but encouraging by respecting, by cheering on that calling in your husband's life. That's what it means to submit to your husband. And the reality is that at times your husband is not going to be perfect. Like my wife would testify that I'm not perfect in my ways. But we are able to submit even when we see imperfections, because ultimately it's an expression of our submission to Christ. It's a mutual submission, meaning that there are areas where in marriage where the husband is going to be more gifted. He's going to be more passionate about those things that the wife encourages the husband to take the lead. Or there are going to be other areas where the wife will be more gifted. And the wife partners with her husband by taking the lead. It's a mutual submission because ultimately we are submitting to Christ, who is perfect in His ways and His love for us. The foundation of our marriage is rooted in God. And that foundation is expressed through a covenant that a husband and a wife makes to one another. And that covenant is lived through mutual submission to Christ and to one another. Right? And so not only God's design for marriage, but let's finish with this. Our preparation for marriage, for those of us who are not married. Now, this is for all the singles. How do you best prepare for marriage during this season of your life? And so I just need to make this very clear that, yes, marriage is a gift. And for those who are married, steward your marriage as well. But also recognizing that being single is a gift. Not only is marriage good, but being single is good as well. Listen to what Dr. Tim Keller says. He says, and I quote, "The Christian perspective on singleness is almost unique. Unlike traditional societies, Christianity sees singleness as good because the kingdom of God provides the most lasting possible legacy and heirs. Unlike sex and romance saturated Western society, Christians see singleness as good because our union with Christ can fulfill our deepest longings," unquote. Right? Our union with Christ fulfills the deepest longings. So this is regardless of whether you are married or regardless of whether you are single. It's our union with Christ that fulfills the deepest longings of our hearts. So with that understanding, I just want to give two practical advice, because there's a lot that we can talk about. But I just want to give two practical advices on how we can prepare for marriage. First advice is this: understand the various seasons that God brings you to, right? And we recognize that in our journey with God, in different circumstances and different seasons of life, that there are different things that God brings us through. And so we have to understand what season of life that God is bringing us through. I got married when I was 30. I was one of the later ones to get married amongst my friends. Some of my friends got married when they were younger. I knew of other people who got married when they were much older. There was a gentleman that I used to know and respect. He worked a lot in reaching out to Muslims in Dearborn, Michigan. There's a large Muslim population there. Um, he didn't get married until he was in his 50s. Now, there's no biblical commandment that tells you that, like thou shalt get married by this age. But it's understanding the season. We have to understand that in certain seasons that God brings us through, some of those seasons are not going to be seasons where we are seeking marriage. So for me, when I was in my mid-20s, and when I started seeing some of my friends getting married, in many ways, it was a challenging season for me because I also want to get married. And I almost felt like getting married was like moving on with your life, and being single was being stuck where you were. But, God was at work in my life to help me to understand that that was not true. That the season of being single was a very important season that I had to walk through with God, because it was during the season that God was breathing into my heart His direction for my life. So it was during the season where I really began to wrestle with God's call for me into the pastoral ministry. And it was also during the season that I learned to minister to others through my singleness, right? And it wasn't until I finally surrendered to God and began taking steps towards starting seminary and so forth that God invited me into now a season of considering marriage. And so we have to understand the various seasons that God brings us through. In 1 Corinthians 7:7, Paul talks about the gift of being single. He says, verse 7, I wish that all were as myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. Now, the gift that Paul is referring to is what Dr. Keller would call a God-given ability for building others up. And so it's not just gift of being single as in, I'm single and I'm okay with being single, but it's actually referring to, no, it's a specific season where God gives you the ability to build others up. And so it's describing a season of being fruitful in ministry and also in life through singleness, right? Now, it doesn't mean that you're not going to struggle with feelings of wanting to be married and so forth, but even in the midst of those struggles, it's God empowering you and maturing you spiritually and allowing you to bear good fruit in ministry and in life. And so some of you are in that season where God is leading you to leverage your season of singleness to build others up in a way that you would not be able to do if you are a married person. And if you think about it, that's actually, I would argue, one of the best preparations for marriage that a person can actually experience, where they are selflessly and joyfully learning to serve other people. But I think here's where, for many people, they get tripped up, because if you make that season of being single, if you make it all about you, right? All about what you're feeling, all about what you feel like you're needing, and you want to bypass that season as quickly as possible, then you're actually bypassing one of the most important seasons of God working in you and making you to be more like Christ, so that when you get married, you can be a blessing to your future spouse. Now, think about it this way. If your future marriage relationship is supposed to be a testimony of Jesus' love for the church, but if you make the pursuit of marriage all about what you want and disregard the very seasons that God is bringing you through, then how does that testify? Right? How does that testimony reflect Christ and His sacrificial love for His people? So some of you in this season of singleness, embrace it and see it as a gift, a unique opportunity, because the reality is that majority of your life, you're going to be married. But in this unique season of being single, recognizing that there's a unique calling and unique purpose for you. Now, I would say the only way that you're going to be able to know for sure whether the various seasons that God brings you through and really trying to understand those seasons is by anchoring yourself deeper and deeper in Christ. And so if you don't understand maybe the season that you're in, then I would say focus on your relationship with Christ and lean in hearing from him to understand what he is saying to you. Now, my advice to those who are single would be this, and this is just my advice. My advice would be don't start to pursue a relationship until you can marry, right? Don't start to pursue a relationship until you can marry. Now, hear me out. I'm not saying that, like as you start the dating relationship, whoever you start dating, like that's the person that you're going to end up, right? That's not what I mean by don't pursue a relationship until you can get married. Because, the reality is that it's a process of discovery that we have to go through, right? To see whether this person is someone that you want to commit the rest of your life to. And so call it dating, call it courtship, call it whatever you want. We have to go through that discovery process, but don't start that discovery process until you can actually get married. Until God leads you into a season where because of his calling for you and because of the work that he's doing in you, marriage is a possibility in the near future. And when I say near future, I don't necessarily mean in the next 5 or 10 years, but marriage is something that you can fully embrace in the very near future. Now, that's just my advice. That's what I've told my boys, and that's the advice that I will always give. And I come to that conclusion not only from my experience, but also from observing many different couples who have gone through many different processes, because the aim should not just be to get through that process. The aim should not just be to get married, but to be a blessing as you go through that process. So you can take it or leave it, but that's something that I've told a lot of people, okay? Understand the season that God is bringing you through. And then my second advice would be to pursue Christ and his holiness. To pursue Christ and his holiness. In his book, Not Yet Married, Marshall Siegel, he writes that singleness is a horrible and popular excuse for persisting in sin. In our pursuit of marriage, we often permit ourselves to fall into holding patterns in our growth and maturity. We're so focused on finding love that we get distracted from killing sin. But we are always being either conformed to the world around us or transformed into something entirely new and different, Romans 12, 1 and 2. There's no lazy middle ground for us to rest on for a few years while we wait for a wife or husband, unquote, right? I think one of the best ways for us to prepare or be preparing ourselves for marriage is by pursuing Christ and his holiness. I know it's such a generic Christian answer, but the reality is that it's true. Because when you think about marriage relationship is man and woman. God brings them together so that in that union, they can continue to pursue Christ and his righteousness for their family, for their future. And so if you can't do that now, right, as a single person to pursue Christ and his holiness, then just because you get married, somehow your focus isn't magically going to readjust to Christ and his righteousness for your future family. It's kind of like, we have a small garden in our backyard. And whenever you try to grow something, not only do you have to water, you have to fertilize, and you have to give it all that good stuff for it to grow, but you also have to constantly take out the weeds, right? Because you don't want those weeds competing against the plant that you're trying to grow. And so pursuing Christ and his holiness is kind of like that. And so what consistent habits do you need to develop in you now that will help to feed and nurture your relationship with God? So that when you get married, that your relationship with God will be strong, and you and your future husband and wife will pursue God together. And what are the weeds that you need to pull out of your life now? The weeds that are preventing you from saying yes to Christ and his purposes for you. Maybe the weeds that are preventing you from pursuing holiness in your life. Because if it's hard to say yes to Christ now while you're single, then when you get married, it doesn't get easier. I would argue that it actually becomes harder. Pursue Christ and his holiness. Now, let me just say to those who are already in a relationship, maybe you're engaged, starting a dating relationship, going through that process. The two best advice that I received when I was engaged, they were this. First, my encouragement would be to be private in public, right? So in other words, don't square away all by yourself somewhere where others can't have access to you so that you can express private things that are only meant to be expressed in marriage. Now listen, it's not going to be very convenient. And we're not going to be perfect in doing this. But strive to be private and public. I remember when Susan and I were engaged, our go-to venue was Starbucks. And we would do our planning and so forth. And, at times it was inconvenient. There were a lot of people around. Like we had to look for tables. The tables were small. But we did our best to be private and public. So be private and public. Not only that, second advice that I would give you is pursue clarity more than intimacy, right? Pursue clarity more than intimacy. Marshall Siegel, he writes this, he says, while the great prize in marriage is Christ-centered intimacy, the great prize in dating is Christ-centered clarity. Intimacy is safest in the context of marriage, and marriage is safest in the context of clarity. The purpose of our dating is to determine whether the two of us should get married or we should focus our efforts there. So we should focus our efforts there. In our pursuit of clarity, we will undoubtedly develop intimacy, but we ought not to do so quickly or naively. But pursuing clarity and understanding who that person is, pursuing clarity in what role faith has to play in their lives, pursuing clarity in understanding God's purpose in this. So there are questions that Marshall Siegel says that dating people should be asking. Questions like, does he or she love Jesus more than he or she loves me? Or questions like, does he or she follow through on their promises? Or questions like, does he or she show self-control, or do they compromise to get what they want? To pursue clarity more than intimacy, and to be private and public. Paul reminds us in Romans 12:10. He says, love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. In the NIV, it says, honor one another above yourselves. Right? By their conduct, by our conduct. Are we honoring Christ? And are we honoring one another? Or are we causing the other to compromise their honor before Christ? I remember someone once asking me, Ben, or someone telling me, Ben, what dreams do you have for marriage? Because your dreams will cause you to change how you think about dating. Right? The dreams that you have for your future marriage will think about how you will date. So for those who are single, what dreams do you have for your future marriage? Because if you are dreaming of a marriage that will honor God and that will be blessed by Him, then how would you change your pursuit of that someone? We want to strive to honor one another. And we want to strive to encourage one another to pursue Christ. So once again, the one thing this morning is this: our marriage should strive to be a reflection of God's love and commitment to his people. Our marriage should strive to be a reflection of God's love and commitment to his people. So just 3 practical applications for 3 different groups of people. First of all, husbands, love and serve your wife as Christ loved and served the church. Right? Are you serving and are you loving your wife as Christ loved and served the church? Wives, love and honor your husbands as the church strove to love and honor Christ. Are you loving your husbands? Are you honoring him as the way that the church strives to honor and to love Christ? And for those of us who are single, pursue God's design and purpose for your future marriage, right? Pursue God's design and purpose for your future marriage. Don't let culture dictate what your future marriage and your pursuit of it should be. Don't let even your own desires dictate how you should pursue that future marriage, but let God dictate and let his design lead and guide you in that. When I think about marriage, it's such a powerful illustration. Paul reminds us that it illustrates Jesus' love for us. That while we were still sinners, while we were still living apart from God, that Christ came and he loved us. He reconciled us back to God. He died for us while we were undeserving of it all. And that's really the challenge in marriage, right? Because in our marriage relationships, there are going to be times where we're going to hurt one another. We're going to disappoint one another. We're going to fail one another. But during those seasons, can we see the gospel shining through? And can our marriages be a reflection of the gospel? So when others see us, that they can see Jesus' love for his people. And through our marriage, that we can point others to Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Harvest Mission Community Church podcast. For more information, visit our website at hongkong.hmcc.net.